for people who are just joining now, there you are. Hey, Peter.
Oops.
There you go.
Sorry about that. I don't know, my computer just crashed. We actually did 2 tech checks even before this to avoid this very problem, and lo and behold.
No worries.
So, are we ready for me? I have no idea what I've missed.
We are ready. We are ready.
Okay, great. Let's hope that's the end of that. I'm going to share a screen. Sorry, folks, for that. I don't know really what happened there.
No worries.
Okay. We seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. And now we're seeing it large?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Let me pull up my little notes here, which closed down in the panic to try and reboot my computer. Okay, good. All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Lori, and the Philly Photo Art Center for having me. This is all a little bit of an experiment, I suppose, because I've never just kind of talked blindly at my screen for a half an hour, and also I'm kind of at this point with the work I've been doing for the last sort of 15 years, where I'm trying to separate the kind of discrete bodies of work and find out how they're all interconnected and how this era is all interconnected. So this is a bit of an experiment on some level of trying to reframe my work for myself. But on the other hand, I'm also kind of reframing the work in a way that I always kind of imagine the work being. But it's a process. And so if there's any point where things are, unclear, confusing, or what have you, I hope you can ask the questions, and I'd be happy to clarify at the Q&A at the end. And so what I'm going to show today is these sort of interconnected bodies of work from the past 14 years that really look at America and the world in the post 9/11 era. And for me, this has been really a story about the excesses of American power and the decline of an empire, and the many forces that go into the complexity of the United States. It's a story about war and loss, of the upheaval of a whole region, of identity and history, militarism and nationalism, race and class, myth making, and a kind of surreality that overlays everything. And for me, it's also been a process of dismantling and then rebuilding, rebuilding in a very altered form all I thought I knew about this country. Yet, photography itself is a strange vehicle. There's the photography critic Susie Linfield writes, "We're still not at all sure what photography is. Is it news, art, entertainment, documentation, science, or surveillance? It tends to blur all those boundaries, which is exciting, but also bewildering and confusing." Those words have been kind of an interesting guide for me is in my own work. I try and find what are the outer edges of the parameters of photographic communication, and how can I try and utilize kind of as many of them as possible and fold them into what my own kind of vision is, and in the process figure out what my own vision is, because it's always a process of thinking you understand something, and then that belief system is challenged, and then how do you confront those challenges? How do you react to them? But beyond the photographs, words for me have also helped give a sense and meaning to my experiences, but the narrative, this overarching narrative, remains so vast and so fragmentary. So before I kind of go through the pictures and tell you a little bit about the pictures, I just want to read briefly from some words I wrote with for some previous books to give you a little bit of like framework and context, kind of for about who I am and where I'm coming from, and why I ended up, in America's wars all these years. I was scared of war, but also comfortable in it. I'd felt it in me from the beginning of my consciousness. I didn't know what form it would take, but I always knew I would go. One of my earliest memories of walking along a beach boardwalk as a 5-year-old and excitedly spotting a little store selling cheap neon-colored toy guns. My father would repeatedly share with me the same story of watching a man get mistakenly shot to death on the practice range when he was just a young conscript in the Dutch army. I think he hoped that such stories could help rid me of that boyish fascination with war. My mother similarly remained in shock that the kind man who was painting our new house and who occasionally watched over my sister and me disappeared for a time, only to reappear on the evening news. He just murdered 2 people in a carjacking. He was a Vietnam veteran, and people attributed his crimes to his inability to rejoin society after his experiences during the war. Despite these cautionary tales, I was obsessed with time-life pictorial histories of World War II and their unsparing images. A burned Japanese soldier, his teeth buried in a death grimace, piles of corpses on a frozen steppe under heavy clouds, a soldier alive at a machine gun, and the next frame dead on the ground on top of an ever-widening pool of blood. I'd flip past the pages quickly in horror, but sometimes I'd creep back and return to them, guiltily consuming their death. I knew more than enough to be utterly repelled by conflict, yet I was undeniably drawn to it. So I'm going to kind of split this a little bit, this work I'm going to show into sort of 2 parts. The first part is the part I mentioned, which is kind of and the name of the talk is Look at the USA, which I guess is in a way the way I envision the title of this work that consolidates these different bodies of work. And that title came from a library card at Baghdad High School, which I visited, which was a Jesuit school actually that trained both, that educated both a lot of the kind of elite leaders of the Saddam Hussein dictatorship, and also people that ended up becoming kind of leaders against the insurgency of the America. And about 10 years ago, I did a story there, and was just flipping through the catalog and found this library card, and somehow it seemed to sum a lot up. And this kind of Look at the USA is this consolidation of these 3 bodies of work that make up this narrative from the last 14 years that Laurie mentioned, these books. And I'm going to try and talk about those as a discrete and kind of clear-cut narrative. Well, maybe not so clear-cut, but one that I've spent at least the time to try and think through what all the component parts mean. But at the end, I also just want to show work from the last few months, which is completely interconnected with all this other work, but it's so fresh in a way in my mind. I mean, I've been working 3 months straight, basically more than 3 months straight, on COVID-related issues, and I was in Minneapolis after George Floyd was killed. I was in Tulsa for the Trump rally. I'm going down to Richmond tomorrow, and I've always kind of tried to be sort of unsentimental on some level and step back from the work and try and frame it in the context of history, which is kind of my real other love, and I think really informs the work I do. But I just don't have perspective right now. It's all so fresh and it's all still very raw, and so I hope it works, and I don't know if I have that much to say about that work. So by all means, ask questions about it, because I don't know what my own narrative is really of these last months. And it's been a real jarring thing where I felt for a long time that I'd gotten a sense of control and understanding of my choices and what I was doing and why and what my limits were. And these last few months have thrown it all to the wind. Anyhow, at this point, we better get to the pictures, I'd say. This is from Afghanistan in 2007, and it's a helicopter coming to land. And it's a strange image in the sense that many of the men in these pictures, these anonymous faces, would not survive an ambush on their outpost several months later that killed 6 of them and wounded most of the rest. This is a picture of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is one of the most powerful in the Senate, tasked with legislative oversight of the military. According to this study released by the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, the cost of the wars since 9/11 has been approximately $5.9 trillion, with an estimated 480,000 deaths. More than 10.1 million refugees have resulted from these wars. Funding for Iraq, Afghanistan, and 76 other global counterterrorism missions are funded by deficit spending and borrowing, not new taxes. Netta Crawford, a political science professor at the Institute, writes in this study, the US continues to fund the wars by borrowing, so this is a conservative estimate of the consequences of funding the war as if on a credit card, in which we are only paying interest even as we continue to spend. It's estimated the interest alone could ultimately be in the trillions of dollars. This is a destroyed classroom in Mosul during the Battle of Mosul in 2016, 2017. I took this in 2017, a few months before the battle ended. And with pictures like this, and in general, there's this, it's so hard and frustrating to try and translate the experience of being in a conflict and all the effects it has on you as an individual, and try and translate that in a way that's meaningful and emotional to an audience that hasn't experienced these things. It's the biggest challenge of all. It's an impossible challenge, but I suppose pictures like this and these things, I always try and look for the familiarity in war, things that we can all relate to. We can all imagine, we can all see this classroom because we've all been in this classroom, but we've never seen our own classrooms destroyed. And so much of the work I do is, as Lori mentioned, especially in this next book that I have coming out, is really about this dissonance and this disconnect between this island of the United States and the consequences of our actions abroad. This is in Kentucky, and I suppose a picture really about the imagery of weapons that endures throughout the culture at all times. I think pictures of children with guns, I always think I'm taking a self-portrait on some level as well. This is from the funeral of Seth Ricketts, who was killed in 2010 in Afghanistan on his 5th tour. And I suppose it's a picture in many ways about the enduring challenge as a photographer, which is where to stand. What are you trying to say with the picture? And sometimes a good picture is just about the raw emotion, but I wonder, well, if we've seen a lot of pictures of funerals, is emotion enough? And to me, pictures can serve so many purposes. And to me, the purpose in many ways when I saw this room was about that disconnect from the society, where they rented out this massive auditorium, this massive convention center, expecting the community to turn out to pay their last respects to a soldier. The military, of course, we very much fetishize in this country, but you can see how few people were there, and you don't even see the rest of the stand. So that's always the question I have, is where to stand and why, because you only get one shot at it. And this is a picture, I suppose, about the absurdity of these conflicts. This was a training in 29 Palms in California for a unit about to deploy to Iraq. And this was training the lawyers to deal with the Iraqi criminal justice system. The irony being that we never subjected our military to the Iraqi criminal justice system in any form. And in fact, the initial pullout from Iraq that gave growth to the rise of ISIS was because we were unable to reach an immunity deal with the Iraqi government for the military. So there was like this absurdity of training for a mission you'll never perform. And within war has so many layers, so much complexity, and violence and death is an important part of it, but it's in some ways a small part of it. So it was always important to me to look at all the layers of these conflicts. And part of it was the architecture of the conflicts and what it said about who we were as a nation and what our strategy was, what our tactics were, and these mega bases that existed in Iraq and Afghanistan that separated people from the populace were so defining for me of our disconnect from what we thought we were doing, but versus what we were actually doing. This is Mahmoud al-Hajj Ali. This is a Syrian refugee. This is in Aurora, Illinois. He was part of al-Hajj Ali and his family were part of a very small number of Syrian refugees admitted to the United States during the Obama administration. Between 2011 and 2015, there were less than 3,000 Syrians admitted. In 2016, the last year of his presidency, the number spiked to 15,479. Since 2011, there have been almost 5 million Syrian refugees globally. So we've taken in 15,000 of those. With Trump's election, these numbers dipped dramatically. By 2018, only 41 Syrians were admitted. Though the United States has played one of the most prominent roles in destabilizing the Middle East, there's little political or societal desire for accountability. Of the millions of refugees from Afghanistan, only 16,503 have been taken into the US, according to official State Department numbers. Numbers from Iraq are somewhat better. 143,729 have entered the United States since 2003. But it's important to note that by contrast, after the fall of South Vietnam, the United States took in approximately 1.3 million Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians. This is from downtown Baltimore, and it's always important to me to show that, that within these wars we're fighting abroad and the vast amount of money we're spending and lives we're losing and lives we're taking, there's this underlying dysfunction in this country, and violence. And it's important to me that any story about the United States is one that weaves in the sort of like vastness of our empire and our imperial ambitions abroad with our sort of dysfunctions at home, as is all in unbelievably stark relief right now. And in a strange, kind of frankly, like fucked up way, like I have some, in a way, I'm glad Americans are seeing kind of what the rest of the world goes through a little bit, because it's been challenging to spend so many years in these wars abroad and come back to a country that doesn't know anything's happening. And now it seems like we're waking up on various levels and of course going to sleep on others. And in war, there are moments of beauty and transcendent beauty sometimes that's what kind of keeps you going. And it's also the reason to be a photographer. This is in Detroit, a family I spent a lot of time with. It's important when I think to look at race and class and that divide and how pronounced it is. It's a destroyed church in northern Iraq, destroyed by ISIS when they overtook the territories mostly inhabited by minority populations in 2014. This is at the front lines, another part of northern Iraq. There's always it's always interesting to find a kind of humanity and innocence within the violence. And this is a picture, I suppose, of my own violence and inhumanity at times. I sort of went through a phase. It's about 12 years ago when this was taken of really struggling to process the traumas that I'd been experiencing and witnessing, and I was on like a vacation with a bunch of family members and cousins, and I was with this is one of my cousins, and I was with another cousin who just lost his mother 2 months before to breast cancer, and we were both a little bit insane at that moment and drinking heavily, and our little cousin, whatever he did, it wasn't that bad, but we essentially, hogtied him to this fence and were banging tennis balls at him and throwing alternatingly hot water and cold water at him, and while he was blindfolded. I mean, it was insane, and I'm not a violent, and I remember at the time thinking it was funny, but I'm not a violent person, nor do I enjoy people suffering in any form, and the strangeness of this impulsive reaction, made me also realize afterwards that how fucked up I was at the time, and I remind myself of that by looking at this picture, to remind me of that shame. And the pomp and circumstance of power. This was Trump's election, the Armed Services Ball. Training in northern Iraq. The spectacle of nationalism, and this is from Salute to Service Month, which is the month of November in the National Football League. And just and the National Football League, and I'm a football fan, frankly, and I'm from DC, and so it's a little tricky with you Philadelphians right now, but there's the amount of hypocrisy within this Salute to Service Month is always, I find, just outrageous in the extreme. And insofar as, you have a whole month of every year devoted to the troops, and there are these things, these performances like this, and the military lines the field, and the coaches and players wear special uniforms that mimic camouflage. And every other commercial is about how the NFL is helping injured American service members. Of course, no mention of the true victims of these conflicts, but okay, that's where our head's at in the U.S. We really only value American lives in many ways, so I get it. But then there's a hypocrisy within even the donations. So since 2011, when the Salute to Service started, I looked up the numbers. There's only $34 million donated to charities supporting injured American servicemen. And that seems like a lot of money, maybe $34 million, sure, in 9 years. But in that same period of time, the NFL earned $94 billion in revenues. So this total distributed in support of the military was 0.03%, 0.03% of the total earnings, when one quarter of your season is devoted to your so-called, the sanctity of the truth of the troops. And it's this sort of just shameless hypocrisy that I find sort of so offensive, This was a young man with his back against the wall after getting hit in the face by a soldier's rifle butt during a raid in Iraq, in which I still don't know what happened exactly. There was a big shootout, and there was a man who was killed in that house. And at the time, I took it at face value that he was an insurgent because he was claimed to have been an insurgent, but it was one of my first weeks in Iraq, and I didn't really know what questions to ask or what to look for. And now if I try and reconstruct my memory of that scene, I wonder what it was that happened, and who that man that died was, and who this young man was. The Ku Klux Klan, this is in Maryland, not far from where I grew up, actually. And I shot the story in 2015, and I remember how enthusiastic the Ku Klux Klan was about Donald Trump. And they even had Trump signs already in their yard before Trump had even declared his candidacy as president. And I thought, well, that was pretty weird. I mean, if the Ku Klux Klan supports him, there's surely no way he can become president. Well, you all found out how that turned out. Refugee camp on the border of Greece and Macedonia. Big part of this work has been looking at the refugees from this crisis. It's not just the lives that we've been taken in the Middle East and in South Asia, but the ever-expanding kind of concentric circles of the diaspora and refugees throughout the region and now Europe. And the performance in a way, that everything has a narrative created around it. Everything is kind of propagandized. Perhaps this is my own form of propaganda. I suppose it is. This was Obama's inauguration, and it's a bleak scene. And I remember afterwards showing the picture to my mom. She was like, she asked me why I couldn't just enjoy the day like everybody else, which was a fair question. And I did enjoy the day, of course, but there was also this feeling, as we're seeing now, that these underlying questions in America ran so deep that even something as triumphant and this historical epoch of Obama getting elected was not going to rectify what lay just beneath. And so I had this also profound feeling of kind of sadness, I remember, on that day as well. And underlying, I think, a lot of the pictures, I just want to show people kind of trying to survive a bit and live their lives amidst the madness and pain oftentimes of their experience. Like this guy, Bobby Henline, who became a stand-up comedian after getting horrifically burned in Iraq. And he had these jokes, this is him with his son, who looks sort of spitting image of him. And we just had the 4th of July, so I'll tell you his 4th of July joke, which is, on the 4th of July, I always go to a fireworks stand. I run up real excited and ask them, can you give me the same stuff as last year? It was great. Anyhow, he does this to disarm people because his burns are so disfiguring and people stare at him so much that he found humor as a way to connect to people. It's from the set of a movie called Thank You for Your Service, which was an attempt to make a serious look at post-traumatic stress disorder. And like most movies that have tried to deal seriously and kind of sincerely with these wars and their consequences, it did very poorly in the box office. This is on a remote outpost in eastern Afghanistan. I'm going to speed up a little bit, guys, because I got cut off and we want to kind of run this more or less on time. This is an arms fair in DC. And 1.3 million Americans, so you have some context, that work directly in weapons manufacturing. More than 3 million are indirectly linked. In terms of just arms exports alone, in 2019, we did $55 billion in arms exports. And as we know from American history, a lot of those arms exports ultimately go to prop up dictators and autocrats around the world, despite our talk about promoting democracy abroad. This is the Serbian-Hungarian border during the Great Refugee Crisis of 2015. It's a museum in Berlin, and I was interested in memory and the creation of memory. How do we define history and memory? Speaking of history and memory, this is from some work I did with the Choctaw in Oklahoma, and the legacy. When you look at modern empire, it's important to look at the legacy of imperialism and manifest destiny and systemic injustices that continue to this day. The Choctaw tribe initially had vast territories in the southeast United States, but by the early 1800s, the American government had begun a systematic legislated removal of the natives from their land. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed by Congress and led to the exodus of tens of thousands of Native Americans. The majority of the Choctaw were forced to march 800 kilometers to modern Oklahoma, watched over by white militias. In the last major removal, in 1838, the remaining people of the tribes were rounded into camps and then pushed west in groups of 700 during the hottest and coldest months of the year. Up to a third of them died. It became known as the Trail of Tears. And given the Supreme Court ruling today that more than half of Oklahoma was deemed to be native land, I thought it was sort of apropos to show something from my time with the Choctaw. It's destroyed Mosul University, one of the great kind of academic institutions in the Middle East, leveled during the battle in 2016, 2017. an IED blows up on a patrol I was on in Afghanistan. Midnight raid in Iraq. This is Ali, who's part of a group of Syrian refugees that I went across Europe with a journalist in 2015. And we spent several years following up on them as they kind of tried to transition to their life in Europe. It's a whole nother complex story, but we don't have 4 hours to get into that one. It's in Baltimore. This is the strangeness of a fire base in an artillery base in Mosul in 2017, and the U.S. wasn't really actively taking part in the battle, but we're providing airstrikes and artillery support, and even within the violence of the years I'd spent embedded, there were these still quite strict rules of engagement that didn't allow for weapons that were rather indiscriminate, like bombs and artillery shells, to be used so widely. But with the Iraqis leading the retaking of the city, these artillery shells were just being fired kind of willy-nilly into the middle of the city, which was flattened and resulting in, as we expect, tens of thousands of Iraqi civilian casualties. Patrol in Afghanistan. Widow just lost her husband in Afghanistan, leaving behind her and 7 children. And this is my father. And I was going to read a piece. I include these things in family because I sometimes want to include, I suppose, in the writing I do about this work, how my experience changed and how it was informed by this tension with my parents about the choices I was making. But I think if we get into all of that right now, we're never going to be done. It's another raid in Iraq. It was this strangeness of these early days. I was very young when I first went to Iraq. I think I was 24. I was 24, and this idea, you want to kind of believe on some level in what's going on, and I got to like a lot of the soldiers I was with, but the surreality of going into these houses on the faintest of suspicions and ransacking them for weapons, and kind of terrifying everybody inside, was just a daily occurrence, several times a day for months while I was there. Another one from the Ku Klux Klan. This was a wedding that a reporter I was working with somehow got invited to. I don't really even know what to do with this picture. I usually don't include it in things, but it's so disorienting. This is after an IED hit a convoy I was on. IED is a roadside bomb. This is the 9/11 Museum. And I always find the 9/11 Museum, I don't know how many people here have visited. It's a surreal place because it kind of tries to take one of the most political events in history and make it apolitical. We're really scared of our own history. We're scared of how we've contributed to the history that we see ourselves as the victims of. We don't know that history, and it seems to me that museums and schools should be the institutions that let us hold up the mirror to ourselves, both our triumphs and our tragedies, but it seems so often it's more about our triumphs. And the Mexican border, the US-Mexican border, part of the ongoing theme in a lot of the work I'm doing of the sort of militarization, domestic militarization. And the president, and this is the moment, as he does in every rally. I've been to 6 rallies, I think now, four of them this year. I think I saw Andrew on this at some point. Thanks very much to Time for supporting this work and a lot of the work in here, actually. If Andrew's still around, thank you very much. And this is the moment in every rally that he kind of incites anger against the media. This is a rodeo in Oregon, one of the moments of kind of beauty and simplicity in a way that I kind of sustained me as a photographer, as a person. And this is another rodeo in Houston. Support the Troops Day. I have to say, when I found a petting zoo on Support the Troops Day at the Houston Rodeo, when I was there completely by chance for something else entirely, I felt really like the photo gods really had my back that day. And this is as the refugees kind of crashed through police lines in Croatia, on the Serbian-Croatian border. And it was very interesting going through the Serbia and Croatia at that time, because they were really only 20 years removed from the end of their own wars, and many of them remembered being refugees. But there was also rampant Islamophobia in Croatia and Serbia. And so there was this conflict between the sort of Islamophobia and this memory of the pain of being a refugee that a lot of the Croatians and Serbians I'd met and talked about. Aftermath of a suicide bombing in Iraq. It's Chuck Coma, and from a story about the long tale of post-traumatic stress disorder. Raymond Hubbard and his children. Raymond lost his leg in a rocket attack in Iraq. Another home raid. This is Ali again after his family arrived in Vienna after 2 weeks on the road, coming from Turkey overland through Europe. This is Fleet Week. This was a former Choctaw allotment in Oklahoma. And a different kind of trail of tears, the refugee trail. Aftermath of a firefight in Afghanistan. I always feel a little funny, like with this and the IED pictures that almost become statues that are Hollywood on some level. And you realize also young men are always performing the role they think they should be playing as soldiers, especially when there's a camera there. This is at a murder scene in Baltimore. This mother just found out her son was killed. And I'm always struck in this country how consumerism runs through every layer of society. This is a rehab facility in Erbil from civilians who were injured in the battle. And it's one of these things where pictures can sometimes miss what can be so powerful about a scene. And what I'll never forget from this scene was even of this moment of kind of trying to get over the pain of these horrible injuries. You see this girl lost her leg, and there were these loud screams from a child who was getting rehab in another room who'd had a spinal injury, and there's sort of screams echoing off the walls. from this little girl was what I remember from the scene more than the scene itself. This is training. This is a young man named Damien, part of this family that I spent a lot of time with, it was a story about the confidential informants and how confidential informants, especially in communities of color, are used by the police. And his sister was transgender, had been arrested for possessing a very small amount of marijuana, and the police co-opted her into being a confidential informant because they said, look, we're gonna put you in a male prison, and you know what they're gonna do to you there, so you better tell us who your dealer is so we can snap him up. But these cops were corrupt cops, and they arrested this dealer, but then they arrested this dealer and told him who'd informed on him, and he went out and found treasure and murdered her and dismembered her body and left the pieces in flames under a highway overpass. And Damien, this young man, her brother, committed suicide about 18 months after this picture was taken. You mute yourself, Laurie, can you mute his host? Maybe everyone is a much needed breather from this. This is from a movie that just got released called The Outpost. I haven't seen the movie yet, but I was on the set. It's a story of this attack on this outpost in eastern Afghanistan, which is a story maybe of heroism on some level, but really about strategic incompetence. Branson, Missouri. Coal country, southern Illinois. Back to Anbar province in Iraq. This is Bobby Henline again, the burned soldier comedian. And the occasional moment of beauty. A March of Veterans, Standing Rock. This is a really bleak work, obviously. I'm not actually that bleak a person in a lot of ways, but given that the forces of narrative propaganda, how strong they are through, the terms of the creation of narrative in this country, I kind of feel it's generally my duty to push back against those assumed truths that have kind of conned us into a very distorted vision of ourselves. But of course, there are times and there are moments where I feel it is really important to highlight, the work of activists, and there are other photographers that really make that the heart of their work, and I admire them tremendously. It's just the balance of things isn't necessarily what I'm looking for in my work, but there are moments like this that are very powerful. It's a bullet marked wall after a firefight. The skeleton of a lynched ISIS fighter during the Battle of Mosul. And this F-16, a $30 million jet, one $30 million, $50 million, $80 million jet after another, flying over Nellis Air Force Base within a homeless encampment right outside. And back to the refugee trail of 2015. Sign right before the 9th anniversary of 9/11, to me, a symbol of how quickly we forget, how quickly we detach ourselves from these events that transform the world. And this is at a tea party in Des Moines, Iowa. So we're like, that's it for that work. That's Look at the USA. This other stuff is too. This is COVID and Minneapolis. And I don't know if we should just go to questions rather than doing this stuff, because this has gone a little longer than I'd planned on it. So Lori, what are your thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, we've got just a few more minutes, and I really would like to give some space for people to ask questions and talk.
I'll run this as a, should I just run this as a slideshow in the background? Would that make sense?
No, let's just get some people. I mean, let's
Cool.
just do
it.
faces and things like that, and because I feel like, yeah, it's really tough work, and there's lots of things in the chat, and I'm not sure where to begin. So there's some like questions like they're easier. How do you travel? Just curious how he travels when he goes to Minneapolis and Tulsa. I mean, like.
How do I travel? Oh, pragmatically speaking, by plane, which is disconcerting. But I wear a P100 mask, which is more filtration. It's a respirator. And I disinfect everything and put on some goggles and hope for the best.
Alessandro says you're one of the smartest contemporary photographers. Congrats. Glad to hear him today. I agree.
Thanks, Alessandro.
Aren't you fearful being so close to these horrific battles? It's a question.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't get into the COVID stuff, which a lot of it's from, a funeral home and in a cemetery. There's one picture from a cemetery. I see Taj. I see you there. I owe you an email. His grandma very graciously let me photograph in the cemetery that she manages. And yeah, I'm fearful. I'm afraid all the time. It's always, for me, it's always been a process of overcoming fear, and fear is powerful and necessary, and courage is too. And courage is a funny thing because it comes in funny ways at funny times, and you can't always rely on it, but it's always a process for me of just overcoming fear. Because I believe in what I do. There's a lot of other reasons I do it, some dark, some less dark, some light even, but at my core, I believe in what I'm doing, and that's a powerful motivating force in overcoming fear.
There's a question. Are you surprised yourself about the way you're seeing scenes? How did you arrive at seeing in such a distinct way?
I think it's a long process, I think, of kind of becoming who you are, on every level of life, and that goes for photography as well. It's easy early on to be influenced by the people that inspire you to become a photographer, but then you have to figure out in that process what it is you have to say. What is your point of view? And so I guess, when I see scenes that seem to be these imprints on the world of my vision of the world and who I am always surprised to see them, because I don't recognize them as being a possibility in some ways till I see them. And that's kind of the beauty of the subconscious aspect of photography, and the way it is tied to the conscious mind. It's this feeling of, you don't know what you're looking for, but you know it when you see it. And I guess how I arrived at that point, it's just the passage of time. Believe me, if I'd showed my work from 15, 16 years ago, no one would be hanging around too long on this Zoom. It wasn't very good.
I can keep listening. Oh, does somebody have something to ask?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So a bit ago you said something about the creation of narrative in this country, and I think it relates to the last question as well. So I'm just wondering, do you went into this work already having this idea that Americans are given a false narrative, or do you think this is an idea that has developed while you have been practicing your work?
I mean, it depends on who you are or what narrative you get in this country. A lot depends on where you were born and where you went to school, and what kind of money your family has, and what race you are. Certainly has a dramatic effect in like the construction of what a narrative it means to be what the narrative is to be an American. So I kind of started off with, and I suppose push back against now, the narrative that I grew up with of the sort of, white, suburban, upper middle class, moderate family narrative, which is one that tries to take into account the dysfunctions of history, but mostly focuses on the triumphs of history. And my own personal interpretation of trying to read deeper into that history, and also now experiencing much of what is modern American history, has altered that view dramatically, which is why I do this work.
Thanks. There's a lot.
Question. I hope. Anybody else? Oh, there's a lot of other questions.
There's one from Andrew that's really very interesting. I don't know if you want to read it or.
Yeah, I'm just reading you. That's a tough question, Andrew. I mean, this process, it's maybe a long answer a bit, the self-examination. I started off covering these conflicts in the embed context, which was both very limiting and very free at the same time. The embeds have come in for a lot of criticisms, but in those early years of the wars, you had basically unfettered access to whatever happened. The problem was that access was so selective, but because it was just the American narrative. But that was the narrative I wanted to see, because my grandfather, who'd served in World War II, had a very kind of profound effect on my life and my upbringing. He was someone I was very, very close to, and his stories of World War II were the things that really compelled me when I was a kid. So I think I wanted to start off trying to understand what the military perspective was, because I had that underlying kind of feeling of connection to it and some understanding. And what resulted from that is the complexities of it, which is that, I have close friends in the military to this day, and some that were alienated, some less so. I met a lot of very complex characters, mostly pretty good people just trying to do a decent job in shitty circumstances. And so it was more about the strategic leadership. In the end, they were not acting with much autonomy, and they were scared. I mean, it's this idea we have the soldier, that you watch a military commercial, you think it's everyone's a hero. These kids were scared. They're scared as hell. I was scared. They were scared. The Iraqis were scared. The Afghans were scared. Everyone's scared. And when you're scared, you do stupid stuff. You do crazy stuff. And it was seeing that stupid stuff and that crazy stuff and realizing, boy, I was seeing such a narrow thread of this place. I'm in these countries, and but I'm hardly in them. I'm in America in these countries. I'm not in these countries themselves. So then that became that process of trying to understand that. And that came partly from myself and partly from outside. I needed friends, frankly, people from the region, originally, their families originally from the region, kicking me in the pants, saying, all we hear about is the American narrative of these wars. What about the other side? And it's interesting in this moment where, in Minneapolis, everyone talking about, George Floyd, and finally in this country, we know the names, we're starting to know the names of people killed by police violence. And that's extremely powerful and profound. But it also strikes me as someone who spent so many years in these wars that we don't know the names of anyone who's died in these wars in our names. Mm-hmm. So that's a maybe roundabout way of answering your question, Andrew. I hope I did.
I want to just keep going a few more minutes, and I want to read them because we're going to broadcast this. It's going to be on YouTube, and I want people to get the questions when they watch the recording. How do you think the returning soldiers have affected policies back home, considering the great number of them who are entering policing? knowing a lot of soldiers, you have encountered them in these roles, but knowing a lot of soldiers, have you encountered them in these roles back home?
I honestly don't know any ex-soldiers who are policemen. So I don't think I could answer that question in an informed way. So sorry, Ryan. I would if I could, but I don't think I can.
Joseph, what are the dark reasons for what you do? Joseph wants you.
Oh, the dark reasons. I mean, I was sort of having this conversation a bit with someone last night about, about what I read about very early on. Maybe you missed it. Is this sort of like, about the relationship between masculinity and war, that war is seen as a rite of passage in some ways, that war is seen as a shortcut to manhood and an exalted form of manhood, and those are things I sort of sanctified at a certain point in my life, and probably to some degree still do. And so while there was a strong belief system that only got stronger over the years, much stronger over the years, about why I was doing this, there was also this feeling that this is what a man does to become a man, and it's pretty silly looking back on it. But it's something that has been one of the enduring parts of the human experience.
Patricia, I feel like he answered the first two of your questions, but this question is about assignments. Do you feel you need to, when you take an assignment, do you need to feel something about the assignment before you take them?
I tried to, if possible, and I pitch a lot of stuff, and again, I'll shout out to Andrew and Paul, who are on here from Time, who have been amazing partners in many ways for me, trying to find that connection between what I care about and where the news is going, and my pictures are better if I have a connection. And I try and do things. So that short answer is kind of ideally yes. I want to feel something. I always want to feel something. I want to feel strongly connected to what I'm doing, but occasionally, because of the economics of photojournalism writ large, I have to do various assignments that I don't feel a connection to because I need them to make the money doing them. But as I progressed in my career and kind of really try and become like a businessman as well as a photographer, to create the space to be able to focus on what I care about, I luckily, most of the assignments I do now, I feel like are things that I passionately want to do.
I have about 100,000 questions, but lots of kudos. Lisa has one question left. I think we can take one last question from Lisa. Thank you, Peter. You have great skill of keeping a distance and giving a lot of context in your images while also giving us a strong sense of connection with the subject. Can you describe how you do that and how you think about it? Thank you.
I mean, I think it's the process for me is I really live with the pictures I take, I always try and figure out not just what might be good in a moment, but what's going to resonate over time. And that comes with just, I have them on my walls and they're always around me. They're my friends, they're a part of me. And within that, then it's also, I've really tried over the years to kind of challenge all my preconceptions, because the longer I live, the more I realize what a fool I've been and how much I've been wrong about. And I feel like there's something profound about being vulnerable while also being really, like, trying to be really analytical and also really rigorous about what is going on. And the reason why I wasn't mixing this COVID work I've been doing and this work I've been doing around Trump and this work I was doing in Minneapolis with the other stuff was, even though it's intimately interconnected and will eventually be woven together, I don't have the framework to have the confidence to know how it relates to that work, and I don't want to be glib about it. So So the long story short is it's a process, you know, a constantly ongoing process.
Great. With that, I think we should thank Peter. Everybody can, if they're sending thank yous and congratulations in the chat. I really appreciate your spending this time tonight with us and sharing your work. And I wish you well on the road to Richmond. Thank you everybody tonight for joining us. Next week, Griselda San Martin is going to be talking about her work at the Mexican-American border. And I hope you can join us again next week.
Thank you, Lori, for having me, and thanks everybody for coming. I hope I didn't, you know, ruin everybody's night.
No, it was really, really powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Cheers.
Okay.